Hey book buddy friends, it's Mary Beth Martin back to continue reading Willa of the Wood with you guys as we find out more about how this adventure is going to end for Willa. I have picked up my copy and turned to chapter 67 where we left off last time. In my copy, it starts on page 334. If you turn there with me, we'll go ahead and get started. Willa found herself engulfed in a wave of running, screaming people and burning flames. A foot hit her in the head. Another foot stepped on her back. She tried to get up, but the running crowd trampled over her. Crushed to the floor, she looked over to see Gillian fighting to get closer. "Gillian!" Willa cried as she reached for her. For a moment their fingers touched and they were almost able to grasp each other's hand, but then the mob swept Gillian away, like the current of a great river, and she was gone. Filled with new determination, Willa growled and tried to get up, only to be knocked down again. Finally, someone in the crowd stopped to help her. He held her arm and pulled her up onto her feet. She could finally breathe. She got her legs underneath her and was able to stand. Someone was saving her life. She turned with hope in her heart, but then saw Greddick's face and felt his hands clamp painfully onto her arms. "You're coming with me, Willa," he snarled as he dragged her through the fleeing crowd. Willa tried to yank away, but it made no difference. He held on to her tighter than he could have held her before, as if he knew this was his last chance. He wasn't going to let her go. The fear boiling up inside her, she fought and flailed against him, but he was far too strong. He dragged her out of the burning hall of the Padaran and down one of the smoky side corridors. Angry at her resistance, Greddick slammed her up against a wall and pinned her with the force of his body. "Stop it, Willa!" Greddick shouted into her face. She couldn't move, she couldn't breathe. He pushed against her so hard that it was like a rock had fallen against her. "The lair is going to burn," he said, his tone ragged with fear. "Do you understand me? It's all going to burn, but you and I are going to stop fighting each other." Willa could see what was happening. He'd lost his twin brother and his Jader allies, and now he was alone, which terrified him more than anything he had ever faced. His instinct now was to clan together, even with someone he hated. "We're going to escape. We're going together now, Willa." She could see the violence in Greddick's eyes, the need to control, to dominate, but more than anything, she could hear the desperation in his voice. She tried to jerk away from him, but he held her firm, pressed against the wall. "We're together now, Willa," he said again, as if he could force the thought into her mind. She knew there was no way out of this. He was never going to let her go, and even if she managed to escape him, he'd follow her. He was going to hunt her down. She needed a different way, a different path. She could only see one way out. Sometimes you had to do things you didn't want to do, things that went against everything you had ever done before. She stopped fighting him. She became very still and she looked into his bloodshot eyes. "All right," she said, nodding her head in agreement. "We'll leave together through the labyrinth to my old den. I know a way out of there." Greddick grunted, pleased that she was finally beginning to cooperate with him, but he clutched her arm, wary of a trick, and shoved her along in front of him like one of the human prisoners. She tried to wrest his arm away from him, but he wouldn't let her go. He pushed her and dragged her down through the tunnels of the lair, leaving the smoke and flames and shouting behind them. "The whole lair is burning up there," she said in dismay. "We're going to make it on our own," Greddick said. "We're together now," he repeated, with a clinging insistence that sent a cringe down her spine. When they finally reached the labyrinth, she guided him through the stone tunnels that led towards her den. When he realized she was leading them in the right direction, she felt his grip of her arm relax a little. She stumbled and collapsed to the floor. Greddick reflexively reached down to pull her to her feet. She leapt up and sprang away from him with all her speed, but he reached out just as quick, grabbed her by the hair, yanked her back, and pulled her off her feet. She screamed in pain as she fell backwards and hit the floor, banging her head hard. "You're not going to escape, Willa," Gredick rasped as he pinned her to the ground with his hand gripping her neck. Her refusal of his offer, her rejection of him, had filled him with rage. "You're going to regret the choice you've been trying to get away from me again. I can now see the nasty little lying beast that you really are. But you're not as smart as you think you are. After I'm done with you here, I'm going to track down those 3 little humans of yours that you seem to care so much about. You forget how long we've been together, Willa. I know exactly where you hid them, and after I'm done with you here, I'm going to track them down and make sure they never get home." Willa exploded with anger and squirmed from his grip, twisting her body and knocking his clutching hands away. She leapt up and darted out of his reach, then sprinted down the corridor. She followed the winding passageway, but she could hear his footsteps coming behind her. There was no way to outrun him for long, and he was too close for her to blend into the rock wall. She turned down the tunnel to the left, then turned to the right. Gredick followed right behind her, growling with anger. When she came to the end of the long, winding tunnel and took the passageway to the left, she did it knowingly. But when she felt the air turning cold, her chest seized with panic despite herself. It was a choice she could not come back from. The blackness of the abyss was just steps away. She came to the edge of the dark hole at the end of the tunnel, and there was nowhere else to go. She was trapped. The whole of the abyss fell hundreds of feet down into pitch darkness. No one knew how deep it was, or if it even had a bottom. Gredick lunged forward and clutched her with his bony hands. He had grabbed her so many times over the years. She had fought him for so long, but this time she didn't try to leap away. She didn't try to dodge him or fight him. As she charged forward, she pulled him into her, wrapped her arms around him, and held on. "I'm going to track them down and make sure they never get home," Gredick had said, and that was his mistake. She leaned way back. "We're together now, Gredick," she whispered into his ear. In a flailing spasm of wild panic, Gredick tried to escape her embracing arms, but it was too late. The 2 of them fell together. Willa fell through the black darkness of the abyss. Her mind screamed with fear that these were the last seconds of her life. She felt the sensation of falling in her stomach and her limbs. Her hair floated around her head. The cold air rushed past her, touching her cheeks, her arms, her legs, getting colder as she fell deeper into the darkness. Gredick had let go of her, and she had let go of him. She knew he must be falling with her, but she could not see him. When she hit the bottom, the force of the blow struck her so hard that it sent splitting bolts of pain through her ribs. The crash bludgeoned her face as she splashed down into the churning rapids of an underground river. Her body plunged deep into the water, propelled by the force of her fall. There was no up or down, just wild spinning and tumbling over and over as the current took hold of her and swept her away. Willa tried to pump her arms and her legs, tried to swim to what she thought was the surface and take a gasp of desperately needed air, but the river was far too powerful. It hurled her through its twisting underground tunnels, flowing through watery caves and narrow chutes. There was no surface to reach, no air, just water flowing through stone. But she was not alone. She had inside her everything every creature the forest had ever taught her. She was everything every friend had given her. She was a soaring hawk and a roaring panther. She was a healing bear and a running wolf. But most importantly, at this moment, she was a river otter. She stopped fighting the water, stopped trying to swim against the current, stopped trying to exert her will. She tucked herself smooth and let herself be taken with the flow, slipping through the water with the water, part of the water, like her teachers had taught her. Twist and turn, slip and slide, the water was her domain. There was no up or down, left or right. There was only one direction, the flow of the river. and she propelled herself through it as fast as she could, knowing that her only hope lay on the other side of the darkness, the other side of the caves and tunnels through which she moved. She didn't need eyes or ears or other senses. She only needed to go where the water wanted her to go and get there as quickly as possible. The flow of the river hurled her into a cave with a pocket of air. At last, her head broke the surface of the water. She pulled in a blessed breath, filling her lungs with the cold, damp air of the cave. Then she held her breath and went back under, continuing through the next tunnel until she reached the cave on the other side. The underground river finally emerged out of the caves and poured fast and smooth through what felt like a world of giant boulders. Floating easily on the current now, with her head well out of the water, she pulled in long, grateful breaths of air. Above the water and the boulders and the trees that lined the river, 1,000 stars cast their glistening light across the nighttime sky. She had never been more relieved to be alive. Something floating in the water bumped her shoulder. Startled, she flinched away from it and turned to defend herself. But when she realized what it was, her heart filled with a different kind of dread. Greddick's body was floating down the river with her. He had drowned fighting what could not be fought. She knew she should have been happy to see him dead, but she wasn't. The Jaders had been shattered. Kiernan had died days before. Cedric and at least a dozen others had been killed in the battle, and now Greddick was gone as well. She knew she should have been filled with triumph that she had defeated her enemies, but loneliness darkened her soul. Greddick and the other Jaders had been members of her clan. She had known them all her life. A memory from years before came into her mind. Just after her sister and parents died, she and Greddick were pulled into the Jaders. The Pateran and his guards took her and Greddick out into the forest alone for their initiation. By the time the guards were done with them, she and Greddick lay exhausted and bleeding on the forest floor. Jaders weren't born, they were made. Willa remembered lying in the dirt and the leaves, looking over at Greddick on the ground a few feet away from her. Wincing in pain, she got up onto her feet, and then she helped him up as well. He limped a few feet away, picked up 2 long spear-like sticks from the forest floor, and put one of them into her hand. "We don't give up, Willa," he said to her. As she floated down the river with Greddick's body beside her, Willa treaded water over to the river's edge, reached up to the low-hanging trees, and pulled a stick from the branches. Moving through the water back over to him, she opened Greddick's cold white fingers, wrapped them around the stick, and then let the current take him downstream with his spear in hand. "We don't give up, Greddick," she whispered. She was left drifting down the river alone now, beneath a jet-black sky and a spray of stars. It was quiet, almost peaceful, but there was a faint orange light flickering on the smooth surface of the river. Still treading water, Willa turned and looked back up the slope of the great mountain. It felt like it was always there, always watching. The dead hollow layer was on fire. It was a great blaze of snaking flame and black smoke rising upward into the midnight sky. From a distance, it almost looked like the great mountain itself was burning. And with that, we will stop at the end of chapter 68 and next time continue on our adventure in Willa of the Wood.